Yeah, you can see Mr. Ramchandran. You're also live, sir.
Okay.
So if I could just ask you to keep your device on mute, sir, that will be really helpful. Mr. Rai and Mr. Ramchandran, if you can just keep your devices on mute.
Okay, 1 minute.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rai.
For those logging in, we're just going to give it another 15 to 20 seconds before we get started. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. My name is Rudra Chaudhary. I'm the director of Carnegie India. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this important discussion on and around policing, a vital part of the India Justice Report produced and published by the Tata Trusts. Indeed, we're thrilled to partner with the Tata Trusts on this webinar and other activities. Today's discussion focuses on the role of the police in India. Each state in India has its own independent police department comprising personnel from two distinct cadres, the State Police Service and officers drawn from the Indian Police Service or the IPS. The state police have two arms, civil and armed police. The Tata Trust report only considers the civil police, responsible for carrying out core police work of law enforcement, protection of life and property, crime registration, and investigation, among other tasks. Yet, and despite being the second most populous country in the world, India has one of the lowest police to population ratios, that is 151 police persons for a population of 100,000. Russia and South Africa have 2 to 3 times India's ratio in spite of smaller populations. There are 15,488 police stations in India. Close to 10,000 serve the rural population and a little above 5,000 serve the urban population. Most large and mid-sized states in India spend between 3 and 5% of the total budget on policing. There are, of course, long-term and deep-seated structural issues around policing in India. While the focus of today's discussion is as much on these longer-term structural issues, it is also about the role of the police during the current pandemic in different states, in different parts of India. The simple and first-order question being, how has the police fared during this time of a complex health emergency? Further, has or could this crisis lead to an inflection point in police training and practice? We kick off the discussion with a presentation on the Tata Trust India Justice Report by Valai Singh from the Tata Trusts. This will be followed by a discussion with an eminent group of specialists and experts who I shall introduce in a little while. If I could just hand over to Valai for your presentation.
Thank you, Rudra. Thank you very much. This is a really special collaboration, and we are very pleased to be doing this with Carnegie. I would first like to acknowledge and thank our partners, with whom we together brought out this report. So we worked with CHRI, Common Cause, also represented by Mr. Vipul Mutkal, who's here on this panel. Then we had Daksh and Vidhi, who were part of our judiciary team. And we had CSJ, Center for Social Justice, and TIS Prayas. With that, I will just start. So the report, the India Justice Report is first of its kind because it is the first ever ranking of states on the capacity of their justice system as a whole, comprising of all the 4 pillars: the prisons, police, judiciary, and legal aid. It is a purely quantitative exercise, and it used only publicly available data through government reports, etc. And it also used wherever possible and as much as possible, the states their own respective benchmarks. And I will illustrate that as we go forward. So just to quickly discuss the structure of the report, as I said, there are 4 pillars. Then through deliberations, discussions, consulting experts, both within the system as well as outside, we decided on these themes: diversity, budgets, workload, trends, which is the intention to improve human resources and infrastructure. And in all, after like about a 6 to 8 months process, we locked in on 78 derived indicators across these 4 pillars. For police, we had, at the end, we had about 20 indicators. India is a very vast country, and therefore it's not really fair or even practical to compare everything with everything. So we decided to cluster states. States that had a population of 1 crore or above were put into one cluster, which is the cluster 1, 18 large and mid-sized states. Then we had a cluster 2, which was the 7 small states, which had a population of below 10 million. And then we had these union territories and 4 AFSPA states that were not ranked. Of course, since August last year, J&K has also become a union territory. So what were the sources that were used? As I said earlier, they were all government sources. So for police, we use the BPRD resources. For prisons as well, the Prison Statistics of India, the NJDG for the judiciary and e-courts, as well as the data that had been collected by our partners, such as Vidhi. We use that. That was also through the judicial database. And for legal aid, we received tremendous cooperation from NALSA, who provided us most of the data. So coming to the ranking, I think some of you may be aware of the ranking or of the report, but just to do a quick recap. So this on the left column is the first column is the overall rank of the states across the 4 pillars. And then as you can see, these are the pillar-wise ranks. So Maharashtra came on top. And I don't know if you can see it on this screen, but Uttar Pradesh was at the bottom. And none of the states, I mean, Maharashtra topped the ranking, though, it also could not receive, get more than 6 out of 10. So that is a reflection of the overall state of capacity of the justice system, not just one pillar, but across. I'll move to the next one. This is the ranking for the smaller states. And here we see that Goa came on top, followed by, and the bottom was, Tripura was at the bottom. Here the score was less than 5 among small states. Coming to police, which is the focus of our evening today. Police, we see that Tamil Nadu tops the ranking. It has been in news for not good reasons, but it does top the ranking when we look at its capacity, and it gets 6.49 out of 10. There are state-wise fact sheets that are available on the Tata Trust website that also we can share. And then you can see that, across indicators, Tamil Nadu does well, and that's why it comes on top. And Uttar Pradesh, perhaps shockingly, and perhaps not shockingly for some, it does not even reach 3 on 10. And it is actually for Uttar Pradesh, the story is the same across the pillars. Now I will just go a little deeper into the police pillar itself. So, when we looked at the vacancy, so as of January 2017, we found that there was 22% vacancy across the different staff categories across states and UTs. And the trend indicator, the trend theme that I had mentioned in the first couple of slides, that showed us that 10 states and UTs across India, only 10 states were able to reduce both officer and constable vacancy. Vacancy is a big problem. Of course, we also don't know how the sanction strength is calculated. I mean, we do know, but is it scientific? And there are questions about that. But given whatever the sanction strength was, this was the vacancy as of 2017. Now we are also updating the report, and we are bringing out a new report later this year. We do have some updated data, which says that as of Jan 2019, the average vacancy had come down marginally to 20%. And the number of states that had reduced both officer and constable vacancy had also gone up marginally. 14 states and UTs were able to reduce these vacancies. Moving on. Diversity in the police force. goes without saying, is an extremely important factor. And we see the ramifications of it from time to time in India as well as abroad. And here we see when it came to the number, the share of women, only 8 states had more than 10% women in their police force. And only 2 states met at least 80% of their own ST, SC, and OBC reservations. This too, we have updated data. This too, we see that, okay, for women, it's almost double. 14 states have now more than 10%. Of course, nowhere near to even the 33% that one aims for. And for the SC, ST, OBC, it has gone up by just 1 state. So 3 states today in India have met at least 80% of their own quotas. This is a graphic that essentially shows how many years will it take a state to reach the 33% reservation. And this is going on, assumptions of if things were as they are today, then how many years would it take? So as of 2017, which is when we made this graphic, 6 states would have, would take over 100 years to reach 33% if they just let things be the way they are. And if they do not do any disruptive, positive transformational interventions, then it would take many, many, many decades to do this. So this graphic illustrates that. Moving on. When we look at the, what is the diversity among the officer ranks, and we look at SC, ST, and OBC. So, you can look at, let's look at Tamil Nadu. So the longer the line, the more the vacancy is the way to read this graphic. So if you look at Tamil Nadu, 39% it says in SC officers. For ST, it comes to 24. And for OBC, is the least among these 3. It's at 10. It is, suppose, a function of their overall performance on filling up vacancies. But a deeper look would tell you that there is some kind of imbalance when it comes to filling up certain kinds of reservations. And this is what we have tried to bring up. And we can look at other states as well in detail. And you'll find the story to be the same. In January 2017, only Meghalaya was able to meet its various quotas for officers. So no other state was able to meet these quotas. Budget, we tried to measure budgets, so of course there's one clear statistic, that is the modernization grant utilization, for which in 2017, only 1 state was able to meet its utilization target. And this other indicator that we developed, which kind of measured the, is the growth in police budgets keeping pace with the growth in the overall state budget? And what is the gap? And we did this pillar-wise. And therefore, we find that 14 states or UTs, police expenditure outgrew the state expenditure. Of course, I should mention that police is the most well-funded pillar among these 4 pillars. That's what our finding is. We have updated data for this. In 2019, 2 states met the modernization grant utilization target, and the number of states where the police expenditure kept pace or outgrew was 8 states or UTs. I'm sure the panel can look at the issues of funding police and defunding police when they start their discussion. We also looked at the, what's the imbalance between the rural divide, rural and urban divide, as in India, we see that in almost every sphere. We try to look at that for the justice system. So this graphic is the way to, what the broader finding is that there's poorer coverage of populations. If justice is a service, there is less coverage in rural areas. So let's look at Bihar. So on the left, if you look at the left side of the graphic, a rural police station in Bihar covers 3 times the population that an urban police station covers. This is what this graphic shows. On the right side, 15.8 for Bihar. This means that a rural police station in Bihar covers 15.8 times the population covered by an urban police station. And so it is to bring out that there is definitely a huge disparity which needs to be looked at. And again, in 2019, we have some updated data for it. Only a handful of states have improved their infrastructure across rural areas. This is, we're just coming to the end. Why should we look at the police? So these are some key stats. These are not from the report, as it were. But the number of persons who've died in police or judicial custody in 2019, this is upwards of 1,700. This is just for 1 year. And then there's a breakup. We've included Uttar Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. There's not much difference there. Perhaps it says something about the state of the police forces. Nationally, the vacancies stand at 20%. Share of women is less than, it's a single digit figure. It's 9%. And as Mr. Mudgal can talk about, and so can others, but because his SPIR Common Causes report documented it very well, number of police personnel provided in-service training over the last 5 years, 6%. That's the training that we've given. And the average hours worked by personnel every day, this is police personnel with no weekly off. By the way, a lot of people don't realize that police don't have any offs. With no weekly off, so 14 hours is their average number of working hours. It's not that there haven't been reforms. There have been attempts at reforms right since independence or soon after independence. As this graphic shows, this timeline of reform efforts after emergency and the Ribeiro Committee and a slew of committees culminating in the Supreme Court directions in the Prakash Singh versus Union of India case. And with that, I would end this, Rudra, and thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was most helpful and kind of set up the, it does well to set up the discussion today. If I can just briefly introduce our panel, Mr. N. Ramachandran. Mr. Ramachandran is currently president and founder of the Indian Police Foundation. He is the former DGP of police in Assam and Meghalaya and has extensive experience in field policing, district and state level police administration, intelligence, counterterrorism, and conflict resolution. At the central government level, he served the Elite Special Protection Group, or the SPG, responsible for the security of the Prime Minister. During the course of his 2 stints in the SPG, spread over a period of 13 years, he contributed significantly towards building and nurturing the SPG to be a world-class security organization. Mr. Ramachandran also served as the chairman and CEO of the Port of Cochin between 2005 and 11. Mr. Vipul Mudgal is a well-known activist, journalist, and an academic. He is the director and chief executive of Common Cause. He also heads the Inclusive Media for Change, a clearinghouse of ideas and information on India's marginalized communities. Mr. Mudgal has a doctorate in media studies from Leicester University in the UK. He's been a Nehru Fellow and has been a resident editor of Hindustan Times in Jaipur and Lucknow, South Asia editor of Asia Times in Bangkok, and a BBC journalist in London and Delhi. Mr. V.N. Rai is a 1977 batch IPS officer of Haryana cadre. Mr. Rai is credited with serving 4 premier police training centers in India. After heading the training wings or academies of the SPG, Haryana Police, and BSF, he served as Director, National Police Academy in Hyderabad. Superannuating in December 2012, he has also worked for 12 years in the SPG, in addition to serving as Special Director General East in the BSF, or Border Security Force. Shireen Vakil is the head of policy and advocacy at Tata Trusts, where she is responsible for strategy development, advocacy, policy and programming in core areas of education, child protection, health and nutrition, and justice and exclusion. Shireen works closely with governments and key stakeholders to ensure that policy is informed by research and practice. Previously, she played a key role in setting up Save the Children in India and was responsible for developing the advocacy campaigns and communication function for the organization. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules for those joining us on Zoom. If I could please ask you to add your questions in the Q&A box, which will be in the bottom center of your laptops or devices. For those of you on YouTube, please add your questions in the comments box and they'll be relayed to me in real time and I will bring them back to the panelists. Unfortunately, we have too many people registered for this webinar, so voice questions will be very difficult. With that, if I could just turn to the panelists, if I could request you to keep your opening remarks and comments to about 6 or 7 minutes, which gives us more time for conversation. If I could start with Mr. Ramachandran. So I think you may need to unmute your device, Mr. Ramachandran. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Rudra. And thank you for this opportunity. So I have been asked to speak about what has been the impact of the pandemic on policing in India, number one, and also to see what lessons we can learn from the way the police has behaved or performed during this pandemic. So I must begin by saying that the police has done remarkably well in enforcing the lockdown. In fact, on 24th March, when the policeman suddenly found himself on the roads and he was asked to enforce the lockdown, he did not know much about the virus or what he was supposed to do or how he was supposed to do, etc. But by and large, he performed well, and in spite of some sporadic incidents of excesses, by and large, the police in India have performed well. We will come to the instances of excesses, etc. later. But in many parts of India, we should also remember that the police was engaged in very many instances of humanitarian work, distributing food and medicines, sanitizers, face masks, meeting the elderly in their homes. And we saw kitchens springing up in police stations, feeding the hungry and, those kind of things. Policemen collaborating with NGOs and charities to enhance the impact of whatever they were doing as far as the humanitarian work was done. So that way, overall, the police performance could be seen as having been, performed remarkably well. But we should also remember that the police has got two roles to play. Traditionally, there is a coercive role that the police has to perform, and it also has a social service function or the role of a facilitator. This duality in their roles also require a kind of duality in the personality itself, which means they have to switch very often between what may be called the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personalities back and forth very often, leading to very many, in fact, behavioral scientists themselves have suggested that this may be one of the reasons why some of the policemen behave in an insensitive or even brutal manner. This is one point which I wanted to bring. But the point that I would like to summarize about four important lessons that we have to take forward from the experience of the policing the pandemic. Number one is about the community relationships. Wherever we saw existing strong relationships between the police and the community, they have done very well during this pandemic. In fact, wherever, for example, the SHO had good relationship with the community or the SP had good relationship with the community, they did extremely well. In fact, very many expressions of solidarity and trust were visible. So this trust is the biggest currency of the social contract, what you talked about initially. And it is trust that will reinforce or nurture transparency and the rule of law. So this is one lesson that we should try and take forward. If policemen can focus more on trust building and engaging with the community, that could be a good lesson. The other was the second topic, or the second lesson learning could be the requirement of clear communication with citizens. This has been one of the lessons which I have noticed, that it could be a very good takeaway, because clear communications always reinforces again what I talked about, trust. And it could also counter fear and preventing the spread of fake news, etc. Some SPs in the country paid great attention to this, communicating with the population through various kinds of things like WhatsApp groups and SMSs, mass SMSs, etc. But many of them did not pay attention. And I would say that the handling of the migrants would have been a great lesson in this communication. Because I have seen in the state where I live that some SPs were in constant touch with the migrant camps, allaying their fears, making sure that they get food and talking to them, etc., etc. And they had great built a kind of trust. And when the Shramik trains finally landed up, these people were able to take them, bus them to the railway station and send them safely to them. But in some other districts where there was no communication, the migrants really erupted in large numbers and came out to the streets. So this was one very specific lesson that we could learn, that wherever we did not make use of good communication strategies, the policemen could not do well. So this is the second lesson. And the third is about leadership styles. Because here again, after my own interaction with various kinds of policemen of different ranks, I have seen that some of these lessons could be validated on the ground, wherever senior police officers communicated very clearly with the subordinates, treated them with compassion and understanding. Those policemen were found to be extremely motivated, and they didn't mind working for several hours on the roads. But at the same time, we must remember that wherever senior police officers treated their men, their subordinates with understanding and dignity, in such cases, we find that the policemen themselves also treat the citizens with dignity. But this is one of the major issues in policing in the country, where many senior officers, deal with their subordinates with a certain level of disdain, contempt, and condescension. This is a very major issue. And unless you treat your subordinates with respect and dignity, they will not behave well with the citizens. The fourth piece I want to say is about technology. Wherever technology has been deployed in a very big way, we found that there is a very big multiplier effect as far as the force is concerned. That plus their efficiency levels improved, their transparency levels improved, and we could say that even accountability levels could be, there could be better accountability levels wherever technology has been deployed. So these are the four major areas that I would like to highlight as the learnings which can be taken even beyond the pandemic. So one more point that I want to make here is that the pandemic has also exposed the police to the disease itself. Because of the very nature of their duties. And as of today, as we speak, we have almost 15,000 cases of positive test, policemen testing positive, and about 120 policemen across the country have given up their lives to the disease. So this is a major issue. Firstly, because it can seriously affect your operational continuity, and secondly, it can have serious impact on the morale and motivation of the force itself. But I have seen that wherever the police officers, the senior leaders have been inspiring leaders rather than commanders, in such cases there is no dearth of what may be called motivation. So these are some of the thoughts that I thought I should bring. And lastly, just as we hope that the pandemic will force the country to earmark more resources to the public health and the health systems, it is also our hope that the pandemic will force our policymakers to bring about the much needed reforms and also allocation of more resources to policing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramchandran. That's a really nice beginning, and we'll come back to a lot of the questions. If I can turn to Mr. Mudgal, and I think this segues quite nicely. So if I can just ask you, apart from your opening remarks, Mr. Ramchandran highlight the importance of trust, of behavior, of communication, and of technology. Is this, in your view, somebody who's followed the police, the role of the police in practice and reform for a really long time? Will we 3 years down the line, when this virus is long gone, hopefully long gone, will we turn around and say that this was the key inflection point for police reforms in India, not only from the perspective of the police force to internalize, to do better on the duality of as an agent of coercion, as an agent of social service, with trust, behavior, communication in the center, but also from the role of, as Mr. Ramachandran said, politicians and the policymaker to better fund a police force? Is this a kind of key period of opportunity?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, there's no doubt about Mr. Ramchandran saying each word, everything is important. And I think my only addition to that would be that, look, police reforms in India so far has been seen as an event, that ab reform hoga. Let us do reforms now. Reform is not an event. Reform is a continuous process. Now, something new we are learning during the pandemic is this is a health situation. Suddenly there can be a different kind of disaster. Excuse me, and we'll learn completely different set of things. So the reform is a process which must continue. And the trust, trust is the most important thing. Trust comes even before satisfaction. How satisfied are the people who are supposed to rate the police, whose service the police are supposed to be doing? Trust is the first and foremost, and it applies globally. You see what's going on in America, it's a breakdown of trust. And the trust does not mean that the one community, if you see almost 65% people in India support the police, they like the police. They have the trust in the police because they don't belong to the weaker sections. So if you are poor, if you are a slum dweller, if you are a SC, ST, then there is a problem. So we'll come to that point later. So what I want to say and it's a pleasure for me to be on this panel of such illustrious people. I would say that, where Wale left, we must remember that all those numbers sometimes, can be confusing. But see, the whole idea of India Justice Report is to bring out the state capacity. The capacity of the state to deliver justice over 4 pillars. Most important 4 pillars: the police, the prison, the legal aid, and the judiciary. And once you put this into perspective and say that why it is being studied, then you say that, look, this is the capacity of the state, and this is where we stand today. And the inflection point would be when you say that we know where we stand, and then which direction we're supposed to go in. So in the pandemic, my first and foremost response was, and in fact, my team was very much part of, in touch with many people who had their feet on the ground, and they were doing, they were helping people in their own way. So we thought that the police was the only face of the state. You're talking about migration. Suddenly there was a migration of people. Nobody had thought that so many people will migrate. I mean, there could be hundreds of reasons. This happened in the last week of March. And people in Mumbai who are working at a, say, work site where L&T is building something, there are 4 sets of contractors and subcontractors and their subcontractors. And then finally, you don't know who you work for. So suddenly those people disappeared and people panicked. And whatever many other reasons, but once people started migrating, and according to, I think some people, it is easily world's biggest reverse migration under this kind of panic of its own kind. So in this kind of a situation, you need a coordination committee, a control room. Who knows where people migrate? Who knows better than the Tehsildar? If you're a Tehsildar of a Halka in Rajasthan or in Madhya Pradesh or UP and Bihar, you would know. And it's quite easy that in India, one particular district, almost everybody would go to Surat. One particular district, people would go to Surat and Ahmedabad. Some places they go to Bombay and, so there are patterns of migration which the people follow. So where was the Patwari? Where was the Tehsildar? Where was the district magistrate? All you could see that in a disaster, the face of the state is the police, which is not the right thing. I would say that if they had created some kind of a control room and decentralized, you go down to the Tehsil level and make a Tehsil level control room. Now, what will happen is there will also be an oversight of the police. If there are a revenue officer, there's a DM and police SP are sitting together, there's a different complexion of things that journalists don't know where to go. Where do you go? Call up the Thana. You need information, call up the Thana. Something happens to you, you are turned away from the hospital, you don't know where to go. If there had been a local control room, you would have gone there. But again, police is the only place. Media has to call how many people, how many lockdown centers here, what are the red zone, what are the green zone. The immediate impulse is call up the police station. That's not the police station's job. This is like a health emergency. So, the first and foremost, we saw that the state suddenly retreated or disappeared or was nowhere to be found. Let me put it this way. A simple thing like I would say that in an unusual situation, there should be a standard operating procedure for the state. For instance, there was no RTI to be found anywhere. I would say in this kind of a situation, the right to information people, the information commissioner should have said that when it comes to life and liberty, very important information about how many beds, how many people have been turned away. I would say, we will give you information within 2 days. And suddenly, what do you see? NCPRI and Satark Nagrik Sangathan have worked on this. State after state after state, the information commissioners are not even working. So there is, you need an SOP for disaster, for revenue officials, for the other sectors of the state, and the police. So if you make the police the only face of the state, then what do you expect? They are not trained. As Ramchandranji also said, that, it is also a question of capacity. It's not just intention. So definitely, I completely agree with him. So wherever the police officers showed the insight and presence of mind, they were able to give good leadership. But that was on their own initiative. But when you have a preparedness for disaster situations, then it's a completely different role. So I would say that leaving everything to the cops was a major problem. You needed to decentralize the control room, and we at the national level we are centralizing everything. The best credit for everything must go to the Prime Minister of India. Why shouldn't it go to the Tehsildar or the Thanedar? So if we are over centralizing everything, then this is what we expect. I would say that the police. Yes, trust is very important, but I think disaster preparedness is something which is much bigger than the police. If you leave the police in the deep end, and suddenly expect them to do everything from, as Ramchandran said, that they are distributing masks and they are also suddenly they are told, oh, jao bhaiya mask de ke aa jao, or go to the hospital, do this, that, and the other. You don't even know what their duty hours are. I took an evacuation flight and I came through the international airport, and I was talking to a police officer who was sitting there. He was a very junior officer. He was a one-star person from UP police. So he said, I'm sitting since 4 a.m. and it was 2 a.m. at night the next day. So nobody's even asked him what, so it's like, because there is no preparedness. I think it's a very good time to reflect and see how the state should do disaster management, of which the police should be a small part and not the prime mover. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mudgal. Mr. Mudgal, before I move to Mr. Rai, if I could just ask you one question. You just mentioned that you've just got back from DC on one of our Vande Bharat missions. And I'm guessing that you were in full view or slight view of the protests in Washington, DC and other parts of America after the tragic death of George Floyd, where you saw this kind of complete outrage and anger, which has taken on different manifestations and forms out on the streets. In the case of India, sometimes we don't necessarily see that anger in the same wide horizontal way. Is it an issue simply of per capita income versus the issues of survivability? Is it a social issue? What explains the kind of selective approach to the outpouring of such emotions?
No, I think, Rudra, you are absolutely right about what happened in the United States. I mean, they have a lot to answer. The police is very, very discriminatory when it comes to the blacks in the country. And of course, the same story in India. If you go and ask a tribal, he will tell you a completely different story from, say, somebody who's a resident of Vasant Vihar. So police do not work for the most marginalized. But what we saw in the United States was that, everybody, when you see what kind of people came out on the streets, they were like young people, they were old people, they were men and women, they were Asians and Hispanics, they were white and black. In fact, you would expect that you would see more blacks come out and, but no, there were more whites actually in many places. In DC, at least, there were more whites, and I was monitoring the media also. So I think in India, we are a very hierarchical society. There is no point actually blaming anybody, but I think we are getting there. We are getting outraged if anybody dies in police custody. But if a slum dweller dies or if a tribal dies in police custody, it does not affect the middle class in the same way as if a middle class child would die. So I think that hierarchical society will have to be more sensitized. We keep on saying that sensitize the police, but I would say that people should also be sensitized. And I think this will take time. It's like a process in which the citizens acquire citizenship. And I think we are getting there, I would say, but very slowly.
Thanks, Mr. Mudgal. And I'm sure we'll come back to these issues. If I can just turn to Mr. Rai. So Mr. Mudgal said something quite interesting. He said reform has to be evolutionary. Clearly, training also has to be evolutionary, given the fact that for one reason or the other, the police is at the front line. Whether it's a disaster such as a pandemic, tomorrow it will be a natural disaster, the after tomorrow it will be another particular issue. So given that, if you could just, along with your opening remarks, tell us a little bit about police training. And do you think, as somebody who's headed 4 large training institutions in this country, will this particular exercise in following the outbreak of the pandemic, will it have a tsunami-like effect on police training in itself, in your experience?
Thank you, and hello and good evening to all. I heard Mr. Ramchandran and Mr. Mudgal. Mr. Ramchandran has covered most of the things which are related to policing. And Mr. Mudgal has, I must congratulate him. He has a very keen insight on whatever field he is covering, but very keen insight into the policing aspects in India. Let me say at the outset, I will make 2 comments before I start. One is about the report itself, the India Justice Report, a very good report, very consolidated one, etc., etc. But obviously, you must be sure about that there is a big mistake the way the rankings have been done. Even if it is focusing on capacity, let me tell you whether this Tamil Nadu incident had taken place or not, but any state where custodial deaths are taking place has to get a 0 in my book. And Punjab, Tamil Nadu, UP, these are the worst states, in fact. They may be spending money on their infrastructure and all that. It is like the body of justice. Your hand and legs are very strong, but your mind and heart is weak. Then what kind of strength is there? So you have to change your parameters somewhere or the other. We should remember that the human resource is the most important resource in the police department. That is the most important resource, in spite of all talks about modernization of technology, weaponization, all kind of other infrastructure and other things. But the human resource, remember, human resource, the person who is standing on the road, at that moment, he is not only a policeman, he is also the judge, he is the executioner, he is everybody for you. He is a god. So that human resource has to be, and this is what I am saying, you rightly said, training is a magic, but that magic has to be put into practice. Unless you put that magic into practice, it will not give the results. The second thing, I was also interested in the query that you made at the end of it. You addressed it to Mr. Mudugal. That, what was the query just right? This was related to?
The evacuation from, Vande Bharat mission.
No, not the evacuation of Vande Bharat. In the last, he said something about
people's outrage, perhaps, when it comes to police atrocities. Was that the point?
No. All right. If I remember it, I will come back to it. I would like to summarize it in this way. We have seen the two phases of policing in the pandemics. Now, one phase is very sweet. Mr. Ramchandran described it very well. And the other phase is very bitter. Actually, why this phase, one phase is sweet and one is bitter is very, we must understand it very clearly. One phase is policing by, I call it policing by instinct. If you see a person doing it, something facilitating and etc., all those things, and a lot of innovation has also come into it. And I've seen police leaders taking a lot of pride in those things where they're distributing food, they're reaching medicine to the needy, where they are handling the patients, and where they're also disposing of the dead bodies and all those things. This is policing by instinct. They have not been trained into this. Remember it. It is the instinct of a human being. If a human being is in a position of where he can help the fellow human being, he will like to help it. And that is what I think the police is a department which takes it upon itself, that they are there to make people feel secure. They are there to help out people and all those things. So they took it very well and they did it very well. But this is the policing by instinct. This is not policing by training. Where you find the police is actually beating up the migrant laborers, where they are very harsh while enforcing the lockdowns, and incidents like Tamil Nadu are taking place. That is the policing by training. Now, policing by training has a problem. And just think of a situation, whatever they have done instinctively, suppose they had been trained into that, what would be the effect? Then it will be a uniform thing. Then it will be across the board. Then when you are facilitating and when you are lockdowning, these two phases will not be there. Then the same phase will be there with maybe the emotions are different. That is where the training lacks. The police training lacks that it does not give you the range of emotions that are required to carry out your police duties. You leave aside pandemics, you leave aside a natural calamity. In normal times also, policeman has to deal with these emotions very, very closely. He is still dealing with sick people. He is still dealing with injured people. He is still dealing with relatives of a person who has just been murdered. He is still dealing with a mob who are agitated on certain issues very close to their heart or very close to their needs. Now, is he in a position to express all those emotions? No. Why is he not in a position to do it? Because that training is not there. Our training is heavily loaded in favor of regimentation, militarization, Weaponization. What is the modernization in the realm of, in the eyes of MHA, Ministry of Home Affairs? If you look at their budget, that's why I'm saying you look at the budget spent on what and give them the minus points. If they're spending on weapons, why do you need so many weapons? If there's a battalion of 1,000 people, why do they need 1,000 rifles? They perhaps need not more than 10 rifles in a civilian situation. I'm not talking about a Naxalite situation or a terrorist situation. I'm talking about a civilian situation, a normal civil police situation. You don't need that kind of weaponization. You don't need that kind of expenditure. So we must understand that the police training lacks this range of emotions we are not able to give. Now there are ways and ways of doing it. Today is not the time nor the opportunity to do it. There are three other things where we lack very much. One is the conditioning. The conditioning is still, we are strengthening the colonial conditioning, the relationship between master and the ruler and the ruled. This conditioning has to be converted into a constitutional conditioning. The colonial conditioning, unless it is converted into constitutional conditioning, and that can be done in the training academies, but unfortunately the academies are failing in doing that. The second is the orientation. Where is the community orientation? Whatever community orientation we saw during the pandemic, that orientation is the individual initiative, because certain leader, certain officer, certain man on the ground has done it before or seen it before or has taken fancy for it, he has gone for it. He has developed good relations with the community, but community orientation in a trained mode, that is not there. And third, and the fourth aspect is the aspect of democratic sensitization. We are sensitized. You know, the accountability, a policeman's accountability, what kind of accountability is this? Sometimes I call it ash accountability. Accountable towards the authority, accountable towards the statistics, and accountable towards the hierarchy. That is the ash accountability. But actually you need accountability towards democracy. So you have to be democratized. In a democratic society, the police has to be a democratic body. If you are not a democratic body, how will you go and police a democratic society? I just don't understand it. And democratization means then you look any aspect, you look at the aspect of caste or communal stresses or gender stresses or all kind of things are there. Even class is important. You think these fellows who are beaten up on the roadside, they will beat up a middle class crowd like that? They will not do it. Or so many things which come even not only in pandemics, but in normal policing times also, you will find all these aspects, they play a part. So these are the four things that needs to be strengthened in the training. The range of emotions, the constitutional conditioning, then I said the community orientation and democratic sensitization. Now let us two more things I would like to, so that we understand what the policing is in India. In the Western society, the policing, you can say, has three factors are there which are constituting the policing interface. The policing interface, three factors. One is the police, the other is the criminal, the third is the people. In India, there is an additional factor, and that factor is also part of the everyday policing, and that factor is the politician. Without politician, policing is not complete. So any parameter, when you are ranking the state, you must look into it, how much the local politician is involved in the policing. And he is involved and he is doing what with the policing? You just the case of Kanpur case is there right in front of us. How the line between criminality and politics is blurred, and how one segment enters into the other segment or supports the other segment. So what I'm saying, these four factors are there in the policing, and these four factors also have played their part during the pandemics. You know why suddenly the lockdown was announced with a 3-hour notice? Don't you see any politics behind it? We could have educated them very well. You see some of the Western democracies where people are going from door to door. Now they are re-lockdowning in Australia. I've seen pictures where people are going from door to door explaining to them, we are going to re-lockdown. Now these are the things we are going to enforce and this is what we expect. But what did we explain? We explained nothing. Like Mr. Ramchandran said, we didn't explain anything to the policeman. He was just asked to go and stand there. There is a law of instrument. Law of instrument says, I use the instrument with which I am most familiar. The policeman is familiar with lathi. So in every situation, he will like to use his lathi if he has to enforce something. So give him more instruments. Unless you give him more instruments, more variety of instruments, he will be actually compelled to use the same instrument again and again. And then we should also understand the sources from where this mentality comes. And those sources need to be attended during the training. This I call deconditioning. Without deconditioning, you cannot make a policeman. If I have a policeman, a person enters my academy, and then I teach him how to parade and how to salute and how to wear uniform and how to fire your weapons and give him a bit of law and a bit of human rights and this and that, etc. And then I say, you did a good passing out parade and you are a policeman. No, he's not a policeman. Why is he not a policeman? Because he lacks so many other things. It does not make him a policeman at all. So all those things are required. The sources we have to know. The why incident like Tamil Nadu happened because of the historical and organizational factors. Those are the factors which are helping into it. Why incident like Kanpur happens because of the political factor. Why a incident like what we saw in the Delhi riot, where 6-7 people are lying on the road and surrounded by 7-8 policemen and they are being mocked by the policemen. Why it happened? It happens because of the social factor. The social conditioning is such, where I think a person of a different caste or a different community is to be distrusted. So what I'm saying is that you have to decondition a person. Once you have deconditioned him, whatever social biases, prejudices is bringing with him, when that person gets deconditioned, then only you can make a policeman out of him in this regard. Then this pandemic's opened a new set of crimes before us.
Mr. Ramchandran, sorry, Mr. Rai, I'm just going to ask you to conclude your remarks, sir. If you could just in about 60 seconds conclude. Yeah.
Okay, last thing I'm saying, what is the new kind of crimes that are actually faced by the policeman? Number one, the normal street crimes were replaced by the cyber crimes. Because everybody was in the house, there was nothing else to do but to be in the cyber space, and the others fellow also became very active. Then imposing the lockdowning curfew, suddenly everybody was susceptible to become a criminal or something, and he could have been treated like that. So a new kind of crimes came. And for new kind of crime, the violations and all those things, new kind of policing was required. And actually we were found wanting in that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Rai. And I'm going to move to Shane Vakil in a second. But before that, if I can come back to Mr. Rai for just one short specific question, and I'm sure there'll be lots of issues around your idea of conditionality. It's a fairly complicated and layered kind of issue in itself. And perhaps I could come back to Mr. Mudgal on that in a bit. But so if I could just ask you, usually in organizational theory, it is stated that when a large shock takes place, organizations generally change. Do you think this pandemic is a large enough shock to the role and practice of policing that in the various training academies that you yourself have headed and served, that will this change the way in which the police are trained? Whether it's instincts, whether it's practice, whether it's emotions, or do you think that this is just yet another period to be mimicked by yet another period in the future? Very short, in about 30 seconds, if I could ask you.
Actually, it should change. It should change. But the emphasis which the policeman reserves for its training wings, that emphasis needs to be changed first. If people are still happy the way they are actually conducting their policing, if they are still happy, and that is why I said the fourth factor, and that is the politician becomes very, very important. So unless the politician and police, they come together, I don't foresee that this shock factor will actually do any change.
Okay, thank you, sir. If I can just move to Shane Vakil, and before I do, we've actually added a poll to the discussion today. So if I could just ask those of you who are on the call, at the bottom kind of your screen, you have a table which has polling on it. And we've asked a very simple question, which is, do you think the police has satisfactorily managed the current health crisis? Yes or no? If I could ask you to kind of put in your kind of view on this, it'll be really helpful, and we'll come back to the poll at the end of this seminar. But if I could turn to Shireen Vakil. Shireen, I leave you to defend the points that Mr. Rai raised on the Tata Trust report. My guess is it's a quantitative report. It's not a qualitative or a subjective report, and hence there's a difference in the way you approach it and write it up. But I'll leave that to you. But Shireen, as someone who's worked in philanthropy for a very long time, you've set up non-governmental organizations, you play a leading role in Tata Trusts, we don't hear much about philanthropy when it comes to the police force. Clearly, there's a need for better training, not just in terms of weapons or tactics or structure or material needs, but there's perhaps just a need for better training when it comes to a person in thinking about emotion, thinking about the social contract, in citizenship, in supervision, in responsibilities. Do you agree with that philanthropy has been largely absent in this field? And if it weren't to be absent, how would it be exercised? Sorry, Shireen, I think you're on mute. If I could ask you to unmute.
And Shireen is not responsible for methodology. I mean, I would say it's in spite of her. Mistakes are in spite of her, not because of her.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll leave that for the last, and I'll let, yes. So I'll come back to that with Mr. Ryan. Very happy to do a presentation. I'm sure our editor, Maya, and Vale can take him through it in detail, but I won't get into that right now. So definitely thanks a lot, Rudra, for chairing this session. And I'm no expert by any means on police and policing. But definitely it's an area, and the whole justice system as a whole, and justice is something that development organizations or philanthropies are not so involved in as compared to, say, education or health or livelihood. And perhaps that's because it's maybe one of the reasons that Mr. Rai just cited, the fourth factor, if you like, of involvement, and that it's somewhat kind of that they don't see what role they can play. And I think yet it's really, really critical, because without a proper functioning, efficient justice system, of which police are at the front of it, you may never have to deal, if something happens to you, like the common woman or the common man may never have to deal with a judge, but he or she will probably definitely interact with a police officer or a police constable. And what that relationship is, and one of the things that is really, really important. So whether it's about migrants, for instance, as we see, or let's say working with women and violence that's faced by women or children, then who is it that the first person who you expect to protect you, and yet people worry. I mean, there are thousands of women, and especially as Vipul was saying, if you're Adivasi or if you're a Dalit woman, it's even worse, who say don't go to the police station because they don't expect any support, and in fact the reverse. That they might actually face a kind of torture and beating, etc. So that is something that I think really is urgent, in need of reform. And one of the things that was quite telling by what Mr. Rai just said is that when they were good, let's take the Jekyll and Hyde or the good and bad case, when they were good and kind during the pandemic, it was by instinct. And when they were brutal, it was by training. So what does that actually tell us? So I think that is one of the main things, that it cannot be dependent on, I think Mr. Ramachandran said, a few SPs or a few SHOs. Probably those will be in Kerala, which has a good system, which were anyway coordinated. The health minister and secretary, as you know, took a very strong active role. There was close coordination. So they were part of a larger system. But even so, it has to be systemic. It has to be all the SPs, and there has to be direction from the top as to how police should behave. And frankly, I think the sort of negative, sort of from the beginning, if you remember, it was really like they were there to make sure like the poor people, and they were poor people, you know, the migrants, the unorganized workers. Like if you remember, there were those spraying incidents, you know, and they were there to sort of enforce law, but in a sense of not for the people, you know, and not in a humane way at all. So, and it's almost like, you know, when I said to someone about policing, they say, oh, forget about it. We'll work with the judiciary, we'll work with, but the police is almost like people have given up on, and we can't give up on it. And that's why I think despite fantastic recommendations, committee after committee, things don't change. But if they don't change, then we as citizens will not get that recourse to justice or the community policing that is talked about. And both from an economic side and a social side, the country will suffer. So somewhere I think that we need to bring it back into why are we, you know, you talked about the issue in America and in, you know, the issue with Floyd, the tragic thing, but the truth is that there was an outcry. But when we saw the horrible situation with the father and son in Tamil Nadu, which was to do with the lockdown, they had not done anything terrible, you know, they were keeping their shop open. Okay, they were violating the rules, but look what happened. And where was the outrage or the outcry? You know, there are a few media pieces, probably a bit on social media, but nothing from the top at all. And, you know, it will probably continue. So I think that somewhere, you know, it's really important and of course, there are people who support, and I think the philanthropists, development organizations, especially in training. But training is not going to make the difference. And Mr. Rai, actually, human resources in terms of the India Justice Report was a very critical part. We had 5 parts, of which human resources was probably the most critical. And I think Vale, I don't know if you were there throughout his presentation, like we saw that there is across the board about a 22% vacancy rates. And in a state like Bihar, it's as high as 53% at the officer level and 40-something% at the constable level. And the thing, and women officers, for instance, are, you know, less than about an average out of 7 to 9% across the country. And yet you're supposed to have women police in every station. And what we're sort of pointing out from the Justice Report is that this deficit in capacity to deliver, that actually if you do not have the numbers, then how can you have a more effective police force? It's like if you have a 50% deficit of doctors or teachers, you can't really expect a quality delivery of health or education, right? So you have to, that's the minimum. Forget the other issues, which are very important, but we were looking at what is the basic. So the number of police were very critical, the HR issues, the infrastructure issues, and budget as an indicator. So if you're spending on average 800 rupees per capita for everything, including training, etc., and police is the highest. For legal aid, you're spending, you know, very much 10 times less. So those are what we were looking at in some ways of getting a dialogue going and urging states and the government and people to say that there is something we can do, actually. We don't need to just say, oh, forget about it. We won't get to court. It will take years. We won't go to the police. They're not going to do anything. And worse, you fear going to the police. You know, there's this awful case in Chitrakoot that you saw probably of the 2 young girls, tribal girls, who basically are being exploited, are being forced to have sex for what is owed to them, and even less, like 100, 200. Now they have been taken off the police officers and into the police station, and they are the victims, and probably who knows what's going to happen there, you know. And mostly you don't see anything from the top, from the senior figures, neither the police officers nor the politicians. And probably the problem is that there about what is it that we expect our police to be, and what is it that politicians expect police to be. But in the end, we are a democracy, hopefully still. So if we exercise some form of what we want and what we think and how we feel, maybe things will change. I don't know, but I'm hoping this pandemic shines a light on problems that exist and have exacerbated. And no doubt, policemen have been burdened. Many thousands have died. They've been on the front line. They should not have been made to do all the various things that they have been asked to do. There should have been more information, all of that. But it doesn't lose sight of the fact that basically the negatives outweigh, and sort of beatings and brutality have become just part of the course and what we expect. And that is the worry and the question as to what is it we can do.
Thanks, Shireen. I'm going to come to Mr. Ramachandran with a question or two, but I just thought that quite interesting in the poll that we just did, at least we only had about 27 people who did the poll, but the question being, do you think the police has satisfactorily managed the current health crisis? 41% said yes, 59% said no. It's just worth kind of keeping those statistics in mind. Many of us, having heard the discussions today, may have prejudged what that poll outcome would have been, but it's perhaps a bit closer than what many of us would have thought, at least in the select group of 27 individuals, the tiniest sample ever. But to Mr. Ramachandran's question of police training, whether this pandemic can actually shine a light to the future, we also have, in addition, a question from Akib. And Akib's question actually has to do with Kashmir. And I think that perhaps it's relevant is when we talk about the pandemic today, sir, we're talking about a different role for the police. The police is on the front line. In many ways in Kashmir, it is living after one pandemic after the other. So it is living after one lockdown after the other. So the role expected of the police, whether it's in Kasargod or whether it's here in Bengaluru or whether it is in Madhya Pradesh, is in many ways the realities of, say, Kashmiris on an everyday basis, where there are questions of sensitivities, of citizen needs, of heightened needs of security, but at the same time, keeping up the social contract. And I was just wondering, from your experience, sir, what is the kind of approach in Kashmir, for instance, at the moment? Is there any specific kind of training that's given? Is there anything that can be learned or relearned? And what does the kind of, because local Kashmiris at some level are having to deal with the everyday, but at the same time, now there's this kind of pandemic itself. So you're on mute.
So I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question specifically about Kashmir. You see, the policeman is the policeman's job is, or traditionally it has been, that whenever he is asked to do or perform a certain kind of job, he doesn't question why he is asked to do this job. He goes and performs his job. He's asked to, if he is asked to, enforce lockdown, he goes and enforces the lockdown. He doesn't have to look at the policy. In fact, the code of conduct of the policeman does not allow him to question the policy. The policy is decided by in a democratic setup by the democratic leadership. So I don't think it will be within the scope of the policeman's exercising his discretion in enforcing or not enforcing. So as far as Kashmir is, as far as training is concerned, I have a feeling Mr. V.N. Rai may be able to specifically answer that question, specifically referring to technology, training.
Okay, thanks, Mr. If I can just turn to then Mr. Rai. We have a question over here from a range of people, but there's a question from Ghazal Shekhawat, which has to do with an issue that we talked about, which is decolonizing the police force. And the argument, I suppose, the hypothesis is that potentially have colonial roots of modern policing affected the way in which independent India deals with its various populations, especially in marginalized areas or in high security areas. In your long years of heading training academies, sir, do you see Have you seen training shift in pattern, in effect? Have we, in a sense, and I use this term very loosely, have we even attempted to decolonize the police force? Would you agree with that phraseology?
First of all, we should understand there is a difference between rule of law and role of law. And this difference is very wide in India. Let us understand it. And training plays a role because in any of the training, none of the training institutions I have ever seen people not being taught correctly the concept of rule of law that is being taught very correctly. But the moment you go to the field, it is like a river going to the ocean. A river, it can be a river, a very pious river, Ganga or Brahmaputra or Narmada or any river, but once it meets the ocean, it takes the character of the ocean itself. So if you really want to use that river, number one, you have to keep it pollution free. So training has to be given properly, and all those concepts or aspects that I mentioned earlier, those have to be brought into training. And secondly, you use that water before it goes and falls into the ocean. You create tributaries, you create canals, you use them into your fields and reservoirs and other places, which is not being done. We are letting it go and get lost in the ocean, and that is what is happening. I will just relate it with your last query. I just remembered where you said that the people are out in USA and doing participating in demos and agitations and all those things and forcing government to go for authorities to go for police reform. So why the same thing is not happening in India? The same thing is not happening in India because the institutions are not strong here. The supporting institution, the sister institution, the justice system are not strong enough. We don't have that kind of judiciary. We don't have that kind of media. We don't have that kind of NGOs. We don't have that kind of opposition parties. Now, unless those systems become strong, you don't think that people will come out and go for police reforms. So people will only come out when those systems are strong. Those systems are not supporting. It is a weak society that we are facing in India. We should understand it. But yes, your other part of the question that can something be done in the training academy? Yes, a lot can be done in the training academy. Like I said, there are sources for these aberrations in the police behavior. What you see in the ground, that is actually not being taught in the training academy at all. But if the training academy changes its ways of inculcating training to the new incumbents, then what you will see in the ground will also change. Some of it will change. Like the social sourcing will change. Whatever you got from the society, that can be changed. What you got from the history or from the organization, that can be changed. What cannot be changed is that what you are getting from the politics, that cannot be changed. And I agree. But the other aspects, other sources can be attacked during the training itself, and you can be made very confident about those things. And
so if I can just stop you there, is why should it take a pandemic such as this for the police to realize that training needs to change?
You're right. The need for change in training is not related to this pandemic at all. The first report of the Gore Committee, the most comprehensive committee in 1971 came. The government accepted it. It's a beautiful report. It is by Mr. Gore was from the Tata School of Social Sciences. And it's a beautiful report. Very seasoned police officers were associated with the report. When I joined in NPA and I dusted it off, I saw that the report has been circulated by the government. It was accepted by the government, but it has not been implemented anywhere. Not even by the training institutions have implemented it. So that is a tragedy. You're right. Okay. Training is, like I say, it's a magical instrument, but you have to use this magic.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Rai. If I can turn to Mr. Mudgal, and if I can just turn the attention of the panelists and the attendees to the poll that we just ran. And the question was, which of the following areas should be the primary focus of reform for the police force? Human resources, diversity, budget, infrastructure, training. And interesting, 59% say training. That's where the focus needs to be. If I can ask Mr. Mudgal, I saw you nodding your head on a whole range of issues. So you're obviously going to have a chance on those. But if I can just ask you if training is not doing what it needs to do to create the constabulary class, let's even leave alone the supervisory class, to train the constabulary class to deal with the everyday, especially in times of disasters and pandemics such as this, isn't there a greater onus on the supervisory class? Isn't there a greater onus on the need for oversight on an everyday basis, which is exactly what you talked about? And just to kind of bring one question back to you, why do you think it was that the local SDM or the IS officer was not in fact in the front line? Why was that role absented and provided to the police?
Let me start with some questions that Mr. Rai has raised. I mean, I have many disagreements with him. First of all, you know, when you see the IJR is a report on the official data. Official data is, according to us, it's a good data. You know, official data tells you, for instance, that much higher level of crime is in Kerala and much lower in UP and Bihar. But, I mean, it's wrong. But you make sense of that data. You put in a filter and you say that the crime reporting is better in Kerala because the trust of the citizen is more. So a citizen goes to the police station and registers a case more fearlessly than a citizen would do in UP and Bihar. So as a result, you know, the reporting is higher, so the crime is not higher there. You put in a filter and you say how many serious crimes have been committed per 100 crimes, and immediately you come to a completely different conclusion. So there are ways of looking at data. The second thing I must say about police officers, every police officer after retirement becomes a police reformer and becomes very, I think that, I mean, their energies, their experience should be used. But at the same time, you know, in the same way, like if we have a neighboring country which has left, you know, the national security to the generals, and they've made a mess of it. And in our country, there's like civilian control of the military. So in the same way, you can't, today's world, you can't leave the economy to the economist. You can't leave the national security to the general. There is a way in which you do things. Before training, you should know what is the problem. And that problem will come from research. Like in the other survey, the Status of Policing in India report, which is also supported by the Tata Trust and Shireen's organization, we found, and this is our own data, because we go to the people directly, we found that the policemen have a huge kind of prejudice against the migrants. Now, this was done like almost a year and a half back. And the question was, do you think the migrants are more naturally prone to committing crimes? And a large number of policemen said yes. You know, so once you know that this is the problem, they have a anti-migrant mindset, then first you know what the problem is, then you go towards solving it. You know, so I mean, and the training is going on in exactly the same way as everything else has been going on. You know, one good officer will do good training. There are a whole lot of other people who come. You know, what kind of people get invited at institutions? You know, it's all. I'm not suggesting that there are not good officers. There are excellent people who've done. I mean, without them, the police would be a mess. But that's not the way you do policing. Policing is done in a very scientific way. You study it and then you address it. Now, I'll give you an example of how they tackled the migrant crisis in different parts of the country. I was talking to a group called Ajivika. They work with the labor in Rajasthan and Gujarat. And they told me that this is something that they saw, that when the migrants came walking and cycling and hitchhiking from Maharashtra to Gujarat, on the border, they were mercilessly beaten up. They were told, bhag jao. And they said, look, we've covered 250, 300 kilometers. How can we go back now? So, and they were so badly beaten up, a very large number of them were arrested. In fact, 30 people have got bail today who were arrested in March. For what? For going home. You know, so there is, the police were doing, you know, what they are trained to do. Exactly. I agree that you have the orders, किसी को जाने नहीं देना है, किसी को जाने नहीं देना है. Now, this is not the way you do policing. If you do this, you become a police state. But there is a problem. If you don't do this, and the police becomes like very weak, and it becomes a failed state. So you have to keep that somewhere in between. But I would say that police reform is something that, and police, Indian Police Foundation is actually doing dedicated work on this. That, you know, you study the problem and then you apply yourself. Now, the old systems, unfortunately, will not work See the way the IJR has one of the central pieces in IJR is the diversity. See how the diversity has been tackled. They've stopped sharing figures about how many Muslims are there in the police force. So since 2013, we don't have any figures on why. I mean, you come up front, discuss statistics. BPRND is there, NCRB there, the fine organizations. But if at the top level you decide that you're not going to have discussion on diversity, how many women are there, how many SC, ST are there, how many vacancies are there, how many minority people are there, then I think there is a problem.
Mr. Mudgal,
and then coming to the training point, the point about.
So before I come to that point, if I can, before I just come to the training point, if I can just ask you is, in the last 5 years, how often have you visited a training academy and given a lecture and spent time in those training academies, transporting the ideas in reports to police officers?
I am not actually that big an expert. I mean, I have been to National Police Academy and I've been to Maharashtra Police Academy. I've given lecture. I think I will not be surprised if it was during his time that I was invited. The reason I suppose the reason I asked the question is on one end there is practical, active social science research, and I'm just interested as a layperson, and I guess a lot of the audience would be, is how does this research say this point about, say, migrants? The research tells us the police doesn't do well with migrant labor for whatever reason. Has that been transported and has that been cycled through the training academies? Has that been kind of pushed out in the way in which they are socialized before they get out onto the streets in uniforms? No, the training academies also get their orders, by the way. It's not that the training academy can decide on its own what to train. There is a police think tank. They think that this is how we are going to go. And that, in the same way as vaccine takes a very long time to become a medicine, there are all kinds of tests. So this kind of study, probably some people like Mr. Rai, etc., would appreciate it, will be kind enough to ask questions, so that we correct it as we go. But, they will not include this into curriculum straight away. To forget everything else, think about gender sensitization, something as simple as caste sensitization. We don't do that. I mean, it's a country in which caste is like racism. We know it for 70 years, but we don't do caste sensitization. We don't do, so that's why we have an extremely casteist, prejudiced, communal, and what should I say, anti-poor police. So the training has to be, there has to be a think tank. The training departments will not decide what to train and how to train. Again, I would say the good officers would still invite some human rights activists and some gender experts, etc. But it will not happen in an organized way until, I think BPRND is a great organization which can do it and which tries to do it, but again, it works under the Home Ministry. So it is not a think tank in its own right.
Thanks, Mr. Mudgal. If I can turn one question on leadership to Mr. Ramachandran. It's a question by Valay Singh and Maya Daruwala, who were instrumental in putting this report together. As you know, sir, is at some level, as Shireen said, we've seen pictures, waves on an everyday basis in different parts of India of police brutality, of beatings, etc. But doesn't the buck stop with leadership? What is the role of the supervisory classes when it comes in times of pandemics such as this? Doesn't the cue have to essentially come from them, notwithstanding whatever training or no training that they may have received? But in times like this, at some level, instinct kicks in, emotion kicks in, a sense of duty kicks in. So how would you assess the role of leadership in this time of the pandemic? Police leadership.
As I was mentioning, we have had excellent examples of leadership, and we also had poor leadership in display. So, in fact, I have been talking to a number of young superintendents of police who are, as of now, in the field. And some of them have shown tremendous levels of leadership. You see, leadership here, one is about providing leadership to the men. And in these very trying circumstances, keeping them motivated. It is not a very easy task. So that is where I said that wherever they have shown informed and sensitive leadership traits. They have been able to not only achieve the mission, but also to take the entire force along. But unfortunately, in the police, we also have large presence of leaders who are not necessarily very sensitive, not only to the requirements of their own subordinates, but also to the public concerns as well. So that is where what I'm trying to say is that leadership development should be one of the major areas of not only the police academies, but also the government itself. Because
sorry to interfere, but if I can just ask you is, do you have one practical suggestion of how you can systematize the bridge between, or the gap between, the poverty in leadership and the excellent leadership that you just talked about? How do you bridge that gap at a more comprehensive level? Is there one practical way in which this could be done?
So this is one of the reasons why we thought about launching this police foundation itself, because there has to be very good, exchange of ideas and information about how good examples of leadership are thriving in certain pockets in the country. In fact, we have excellent islands of excellence in different parts of the country doing fantastic work. Now, these islands of excellence generally die down. For example, if a good officer presents great leadership in doing a certain reform, the moment he gets transferred, this entire, the initiative itself dies down. So that is why it is very important that these leaders come together, do in an informal platform. I mean, not necessarily under the supervision of the government, but on an informal platform, they interact and take, ideas forward. So, these kind of, as of now, unlike in the past, there is a lot of interaction and what may be called in-service training programs for police officers, especially at the IPS level these days. Although we don't have sufficient training capacity as far as lower level or relatively, lower level officials are concerned. Right. That is one of the major banes of the police, in the sense that unlike, except for the beginning, the what may be called the induction training that takes place at the beginning of the career of an officer, very rarely does he get a chance to go back to the training school and get his knowledge as well as his attitudes further refreshed.
And sorry, sir, just in 20 seconds, if I can ask you a question is, do you think leading women police officers do better than leading men police officers when it comes to managing the duality between the social contract and coercion that you talked about earlier?
So women have shown fantastic leadership qualities in many ways in the country. We have had some of the most outstanding women leaders in this country, but I am still not very sure if I can make a sweeping comment that every woman has risen to that occasion. Every woman in the leadership.
Thank you. This discussion could go on for a very long time. And I think, from our perspective, there's a lot more that I think we could do in a very modest role of playing the bridge between practitioners on the one side and experts on the other. But I'm going to give the last word to Shireen Vakil. And Shireen, just occurred to me is the point that Mr. Ramachandran made, which is, I think, also on the role of socialization of police officers. I work in the think tank community. I know about a good 15 or 20 think tanks in India. None of us work on the police. We work on the armed forces. We work on nuclear security. We work on labor, capital, land. We work on technology. But perhaps just in one way, just as by way of observation and suggestion as a layperson here, is perhaps that needs to change. Perhaps more police officers need to be sitting not only in think tanks, but other institutions, in universities with secondments at an early stage in their development and career, rather than at the late or the end stage of their career development. So, so I'll leave that with you, but the last word is saying, so what's the next move after this this particular report? Well, I mentioned that there's another report coming out in a while. How is the Tata Trust taking this forward?
I mean, I think that hopefully, we can look at that updating this report and trying to see, how we can work with different states and at the center with perhaps with the police academy, with looking. In fact, there is a conference of DGs that we were looking at for the next time to present at, and try to work with different states and chief secretaries, etc., to see how to move to improve both policing, but also reduce the pendency load, the prisons issues, and of course the legal aid. So the whole system needs to kind of improve overall, but police especially because they are at the front and they are at the pivot as well. I think, and I think there needs to be this dialogue with public and have more police officers. If there are these good police officers, maybe create more leadership there, more positive leadership, and the whole paradigm of training probably needs to shift as to what is the fundamental role and duty of the police, and what is the kind of perception, and what do public want, and what do probably politicians want, and how maybe kind of have for the public to have more say. And that's why I think that it's really important to look at how we can create more dialogue and because to get them to be policing for the people, and especially for the poor, and be a kind of stronger, better, more community-based police force.
Thanks, Shireen. And in whichever modest way we can, we'd be delighted to help and work with the Tata Trusts and any other organization in this. And we also hope in this, while it is to kind of, in socialization of the police force, but our hope also perhaps is to make sure that no police woman or policeman in the future should have to work for 14 hours a day, as has been the result of this study, or no police person sitting at an airport should have to have worked for close to 22 hours. So I think as much as policing perhaps needs to change in terms of social contracts and understanding and instinct, perhaps we as a society need to do a lot more, and a polity, to make sure that police service has those opportunities and not even luxuries, just everyday necessity. But with that, if I could please thank Mr. Rai, Mr. Ramachandran, Mr. Mudgal, and Shireen Vakil. We were delighted as part of Carnegie India to be part of this journey with the Tata Trust, and we very much look forward to doing more. Thank you very much. And thanks to our audience and for taking time on the polls. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.